Before we dive into the depths of space, hit that like button, comment your favorite sci-fi trope below, and subscribe so you don't miss the next epic chapter of this human factor story. The bridge of the TSC Vindicator was a symphony of cacophony, a chaotic concert orchestrated by high-tension plasma discharges and the booming basso registers of its primary crew cohort. The Vindicator was a joint Federation training vessel, but in practice, it was a floating proving ground dominated by the Cthar, a species resembling upright terrestrial bears, all muscled aggression and razor-sharp, performative dominance. To the Cthar, volume was synonymous with authority. Their very command structure was built upon the principle of the loudest roar securing the highest status. Cadet Commander Darius, a Cthar whose thick rust-red coat bristled with aggressive energy, was the bridge's natural acoustic centerpiece. When Darius issued an order, the air itself seemed to vibrate. When he was merely discussing dinner rations, the sound was still enough to set sensitive instruments humming. He thrived on the noise, viewing it as a tangible projection of his inherent superiority. His current performance involved berating a subordinate over a misplaced data chit, an event he conducted with the theatrical urgency of a core breach, concluding with a gravelly, room-shaking snarl that sent most of the smaller, non-predator species shrinking into their consoles. Elias Vance, human cadet, was the antithesis of this environment. He occupied a small sensor monitoring station near the stern bulkheads, a position he had requested not out of timidity, but for acoustic privacy. Elias was lean, almost slight, and possessed the disconcerting stillness of a deep-water hunter. His movements were minimal, precise, and utterly devoid of the wasted energy that characterized his Cthar counterparts. He was observing, always observing, cataloging the fluctuating noise levels and corresponding stress indicators of every being in the room. His focus was not on the ship, but on the crew's operational efficiency, or crushing lack thereof. Elias's voice was his most frequently remarked upon feature, almost always followed by derisive scorn. It was naturally soft, a calm baritone that barely carried past the 2-meter mark. When he spoke, he never shouted. He modulated his tone for maximum clarity and necessary impact, treating communication as the transfer of vital data, not the projection of ego. To the Cthar, this quietude was evidence of a fundamental prey-like weakness, a lack of the necessary physical presence required for command. A minor navigational error suddenly flashed across the main tactical display. The Vindicator was drifting a fraction of a degree off course toward a gravitational anomaly, an easily correctable deviation that nevertheless sent Darius into an immediate, furious vocal torrent. "Helm? Correct trajectory Alpha 9. Are your sensors malfunctioning, you witless hatchling?" Darius roared, the sheer volume making the helm officer flinch and momentarily hesitate. Elias, without moving his head from his console, opened a localized comm channel to Captain Eva Rostova, the supervising human instructor who sat silently in the command chair. His voice was a calm, almost musical whisper, cutting through the din like a surgical laser. "Captain, the trajectory correction is a simple bias error, not a sensor malfunction. Helm is overcompensating due to the Cthar vocal stimulus. Recommend an immediate course correction of 347 degrees, standard velocity 42 seconds, then reset." Rostova's eyes, keen and intelligent, met Elias's for a bare instant. She didn't acknowledge him verbally, but she immediately relayed the core of his instruction through the ship's internal address system, her own voice crisp and authoritative. The helm officer executed the maneuver perfectly. The error was gone. Darius, still panting from his tirade, assumed his roar had scared the error out of the system and took the credit with a satisfied snort. Elias simply logged the incident, noting the Cthar communication latency at 7 seconds. Later, during a lull in diagnostics, Darius sauntered over to Elias's station, his massive form deliberately intimidating. He rested a heavy, clawed hand on the corner of the human's console, radiating disdain. "Vance," Darius growled, the noise level immediately drawing the attention of every other Cthar in the room. "I observe your constant whispering. You speak as though you fear your own voice. Why do you reserve such pathetic volume for your interactions? Do you imagine that a true crisis will pause for you to politely murmur your intentions? Elias turned his chair slowly, meeting the predator's gaze without flinching. His expression was placid, almost unnervingly still. "Commander Darius," Elias replied, his voice just loud enough for Darius to hear clearly but no one else. "I assure you my intent is not fear. I reserve volume for emergencies. When the stakes truly escalate, I guarantee my voice will be the only one you hear." Darius laughed, a booming chest-rattling sound that was profoundly insulting. "Then I suggest you purchase a larger set of lungs, human. Because around here the quiet voice is the prey's voice and prey is never heard." He punctuated his dismissal with a dismissive cuff to the air near Elias's shoulder and walked away, certain he had crushed the human spirit with a few casual bellows. Elias watched him go. The mockery was expected. What Darius didn't understand was that Elias wasn't studying what they shouted. He was studying the patterns of their panic, the specific tonal breakdowns that indicated sensory overload and loss of control. He knew that in an environment optimized for complex, high-speed information transfer, the Kthar's aggressive, ego-driven vocalizations were not a sign of strength, but a structural, fatal weakness. And soon he knew they would all be forced to listen. The next rotation brought the training crew into a true cognitive crucible, a high-stress, triple-task scenario designed to test coordination under pressure. The simulation demanded simultaneous precision in navigating a densely populated, unstable asteroid field, micromanaging a severely handicapped reactor core, and responding to 3 separate, conflicting distress signals. It was a test engineered for failure, intended to reveal the communication chinks in the multi-species armor. For the Kthar cadets, however, it was simply an invitation to escalate their vocal intensity. The console lights began blinking red. The audible warnings, designed to be sharp and distinct, were instantly smothered by the wall of noise emanating from the predator section of the bridge. Darius was the loudest, his thick throat cords vibrating with guttural demands and status challenges. He wasn't focused on the data. He was focused on asserting control over the chaotic soundscape. "Pilot, hold the line." "I said hold the line." "That tremor is negligible," he roared, overriding a subordinate who was attempting to relay crucial velocity data. His subordinates responded in kind, their shouts competing for audibility. "The core is fluctuating, Commander." "I need 10 units of water ice injection," yelled the engineer. "The sensor array is overloading. I cannot distinguish rock from debris," screamed the NAV officer. The overlapping, incoherent din rendered precise information meaningless. The avian pilot, designed for acute auditory processing, began shaking his head, visibly distressed, while the crustacean engineer retreated into his carapace, unable to filter the barrage of competing, aggressive frequencies. The Kthar were not communicating. They were simply drowning one another out in a futile, self-defeating volume war. Elias Vance watched the ship's projected survival rate plummet, not because of the external threats, but because of the internal communication collapse. He saw the critical error. A localized sensor array near the bow was feeding back into itself, generating a false positive reading. A phantom asteroid registered as an immediate collision threat, reading 4 beta. Darius, relying on raw volume and the most immediate source of alarm, was fixated on this false threat. If he executed a hard maneuver to avoid the ghost asteroid, he would bleed off the precious reactor stability they needed. Elias knew this was the moment. He pushed himself away from his station and moved toward Darius. He didn't rush or interrupt the flow of shouts. He waited until a micro-pause in Darius's rapid-fire commands, and then he spoke, ensuring his voice was low, absolutely steady, and focused directly on the commander's inner ear. "Commander," Elias said, his voice quiet but possessing an unnerving, perfect acoustic stability. "The proximity sensor data, reading 4 beta, is corrupted. It is a feedback loop. Ignore that reading. I repeat, ignore the false positive and stabilize the core first." The precision of the tone, the calm delivery amidst the sonic storm, only seemed to enrage Darius further. The commander spun around, his claws flexing and his frill puffing out in contempt. He looked down at the human, whose composure suggested complete control, and interpreted it as the ultimate form of impudence. "Silence, little human." Darius's voice was a peremptory bellow that shook Elias's tunic. "I hear your pathetic squeaks attempting to override a clear collision warning. We are in crisis, Vance. A leader must project strength, authority, and urgency. Your timid murmurs lack the necessary projection to secure compliance. Stand down, you lack the spine for this environment." Darius didn't even process the content of the warning, dismissing it purely based on the volume of its delivery. He immediately turned back to the helm officer, ignoring Elias completely, and roared a definitive order to execute a hard starboard turn to avoid the phantom threat. The helm officer, caught between the certainty of the junior human's data and the overwhelming volume of the commander's ego, deferred to the noise. The hard turn successfully avoided the ghost asteroid. It also instantly overloaded the already strained containment field, maintaining the simulated reactor's output balance. A shrill, computerized voice cut through the air, overriding even Darius's volume. "Simulation failure. Reactor containment breach. Catastrophic core damage achieved." The lights returned to normal, the simulated noise cut off, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Darius stood frozen, his mighty chest heaving with spent adrenaline and confusion. He had shouted his way to total failure. Elias, still standing where he had been dismissed, offered no comment. He simply returned to his station, his silence now seeming heavy and absolute. He had his data. He knew precisely how high the volume had to be before the Kthar stopped listening to anything, including the quiet, undeniable truth. And he knew exactly how much lower his own voice had to be to cut through their noise and hit the animal instinct below the ego. His preparation was complete. All that remained was the real test. The moment of reckoning arrived with the stark, non-simulated sound of tearing metal. A sudden violent shudder ripped through the Vindicator, instantly tripping every critical alarm filter on the bridge. Unlike the clean, distinct warnings of the simulation, this was a primal, grinding noise, quickly followed by the shriek of atmosphere escaping a hull breach in the 4 sections. Red emergency lights, harsh and frantic, pulsed across the deck. This was not a test. The Kthar, built for instinctive, aggressive defense, immediately devolved. Their advanced training vaporized under the sheer stress of reality. Commander Darius's first response was an ear-splitting, panicked roar that had no semantic content. It was a pure, territorial alarm, meant to assert his own survival instincts above all others. His subordinates quickly joined in, their vocalizations overlapping into an impenetrable wave of guttural, high-frequency chaos. They were shouting conflicting damage reports, issuing redundant commands, and demanding immediate, counterproductive actions, all fueled by pure adrenaline and the ingrained belief that the highest volume equated to the correct order. "Main power fluctuation. We are losing shield modulation," screamed a Kthar officer. "Atmospherics dropping in Section 6. "Seal the blast doors," yelled another, only to be instantly contradicted by Darius. "No. Vent the plasma conduits first, stabilize power." The noise was not just confusing, it was physically painful, a sensory assault that paralyzed the avian pilot and caused the smaller, more cerebral species to freeze. Elias Vance stood amidst the deluge of sound, the epicenter of the predator panic, and felt an unexpected calm settle over him. He was watching the inevitable conclusion of their communication style. When volume became the only metric, communication ceased. His eyes scanned the primary sensor stream, tracking the 3 vital threads of information: the hull breach location, the resulting power sag, and most critically, the core cooling loop. The chief engineer, a nervous, elderly Kthar named Grok, managed to override the noise momentarily with a frantic, trembling broadcast. "Containment field is failing. Cooling line breached. 90 seconds until primary shutdown." 90 seconds. The fix required a 3-part asynchronous sequence. A microjump of the inertia dampeners to reseat a fused conduit, an immediate 3-second power spike to force the cooling fluid through the breach before it crystallized, and finally, a manual override of the main external vent system. This sequence was counterintuitive and dangerous, demanding surgical precision and absolute compliance. It could not be achieved by shouting. Elias moved. He stepped away from the bulkhead and walked toward the center of the command pit, placing himself directly in Darius's line of sight. He did not rush, he did not shout, and he did not gesture wildly. He simply presented himself, perfectly calm, utterly still. Then Elias spoke. He did not speak loud. He spoke precise. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, amplified not by volume, but by its perfect pitch and modulation, a sound that, instead of competing with the Kthar roars, cut clean beneath them. It was the absolute, focused clarity of a single note against a wave of static, and it carried the weight of non-negotiable authority. All hands. The two words were a controlled exhalation, yet they stopped Darius mid-scream. The commander, for the first time, went silent, his instincts recognizing a vocal pattern that transcended the squabble for status. Elias continued, addressing each officer by task, not by rank, delivering the complicated sequence in 3 distinct, perfectly paced segments. He omitted all unnecessary articles, prepositions, and emotional inflection, making his speech pure instruction. Engineer, Grok. Inertia dampeners, manual cycle. Now. Grok, whose heart rate was visible on his chest monitor, obeyed instantly, his predator brain recognizing the tone of calculated, assured finality. Helmsman, course vector 745. 5 degrees port yaw. Hold. Commander Darius, external vents. Precharged plasma purge. Execute command Epsilon 7. Now. Elias's voice never wavered, never strained, never rose above the level of a firm conversational pronouncement. But in the midst of the Kthar panic, this perfect, quiet command was recognized by their oldest, deepest instincts as the sound of the ultimate calm alpha, the leader who did not need to shout to know he held the solution. The volume of the Kthar was a desperate attempt to gain control. Elias's quiet voice was simply the sound of already possessing it. They stopped competing and they obeyed. The instant Elias finished the 3-part directive, an eerie, almost painful silence dropped over the command deck. It wasn't the silence of resolution, it was the silence of shock, immediately followed by the visceral response of deep, predator instinct. Every Kthar on the bridge, from the most junior cadet to Commander Darius himself, had stopped their panicked roaring and were now moving, executing the precise tasks given to them by the quiet human. Darius, his mind still reeling from the sheer, unexpected authority contained in Elias's low voice, found his massive body already complying with the command to initiate Epsilon 7, a highly technical and dangerous plasma purge sequence. He hadn't consciously registered the command's content or source, only its absolute, non-negotiable certainty. His training, which stressed deference to the superior combatant, had overridden his ego. In that fraction of a second, his primal brain had catalogued Elias's unnerving composure as the ultimate display of control, the calmness of a superior who did not need to waste energy on volume, because the situation was already under complete intellectual domination. The execution was flawless, precisely because it was done without argument or noise. Grok, the nervous engineer, executed the manual cycle on the inertia dampeners with shaking hands, but perfect timing. The dampeners shifted, giving a brief, counterintuitive lurch to the ship, but successfully reseating the fused conduit. Simultaneously, the helmsman, who had been seconds away from a nervous breakdown under Darius's shouting, followed the exact vector and yaw specified by Elias. Then came Darius's action. The moment the conduit was reseated, he slammed his fist onto the Epsilon 7 actuator. A powerful surge of plasma coolant blasted into the damaged loop, forced through by the controlled power spike that Grok initiated immediately after. The ship bucked violently, and the main alert console, previously screaming red warnings, flashed green as the cooling system, against all odds, stabilized in the auxiliary loop. The crisis ended in 60 seconds, 25 seconds short of the catastrophic failure threshold Grok had predicted. The bridge remained suspended in the heavy, astonished quiet. The only sounds were the slow, rhythmic hum of the restored cooling field and the ragged, shallow breathing of the Kthar. They slowly looked up from their consoles, their eyes wide with confusion and residual adrenaline. They had just saved the ship, but the mechanism of their survival defied their entire cultural understanding of leadership. They had obeyed the weakest voice, the softest sound in the room, and that voice had commanded them, the apex predators, into perfect, life-saving synchronization. Elias, having confirmed the successful stabilization on his own monitor, simply retrieved a forgotten data chit from the corner of the console Darius had slapped moments before. He adjusted the angle of his chair and returned to monitoring his sensor readouts, his breathing still as calm and regulated as the ship's stabilized reactor. His action was a powerful piece of nonverbal communication. The emergency was over and his job was done. There was no boast, no triumphant glare, no "I told you so." His quietness now felt immense, a massive, deep well of controlled capability. From the command throne, Captain Rostova watched the exchange with a profound understanding. She knew exactly what had transpired. The Kthar had been paralyzed by their own noise, mistaking ego for efficacy. Elias had cut through the chaos not by increasing his volume, but by isolating his authority. His voice had registered to the predatory aliens not as a junior suggestion, but as the cool, non-emotional voice of the higher intelligence, the one who held the complete solution and had no need to fight for the right to speak. Rostova's gaze lingered on Darius, who was still staring blankly at the Epsilon 7 actuator. The commander's chest was deflated, his earlier bombast replaced by an undeniable recognition of a superior force. He hadn't been defeated by a shout, he had been dominated by a whisper. The realization was clearly profound, threatening to rewire his very concept of command. Elias Vance was no longer the soft-voiced human. He was the quiet alpha, and the Kthar instinct had forced them to obey. Rostova finally leaned back, the faintest hint of a smirk touching her lips, and quietly initiated the after-action report. The real test of leadership wasn't over, it was just beginning. The post-crisis debriefing was held in a segregated observation room, the atmosphere thick with professional formality and the low-frequency humming of bewildered Kthar metabolism. The alien command staff, a quartet of rigid, scaled officers, kept directing pointed queries at Darius, demanding a logical explanation for his abrupt and unquestioning obedience to a junior cadet's command. Darius, stripped of his vocal superiority, was visibly struggling to articulate his surrender. "Commander Darius," pressed the lead officer, a serpentine strategist named Xylor, whose voice was a dry rasp. "Your internal logs show you were overridden by Cadet Vance's directive. Yet you executed a highly risky maneuver, Epsilon 7, on his single low-volume word. Why did you not challenge his authority, or at minimum, demand corroborating volume?" Darius shifted his considerable bulk, the movement betraying genuine unease. The sound was not loud. He finally managed, his own voice unnaturally subdued, a gravelly whisper. "It was heavy. It contained no challenge, no hesitation. Every conflicting thought I had was simply excised. It was the sound of certainty. My instinctual pattern recognition perceived a higher, more complete order of authority than my own or anyone else's competing shouts." It was a staggering admission, the apex predator confessing that a human's quiet control had superseded his ingrained hierarchy of noise. Elias, standing off to the side, was invited to speak. He stepped forward, his posture relaxed, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He didn't gloat or posture. He simply offered a detached, scientific explanation for the Kthar's behavioral paradox. "Commander Darius's assessment is correct," Elias stated, his voice the same clear, modulated baritone that had saved the ship. "The Kthar communication protocol is optimized for status competition and territorial defense. In a high-complexity, novel crisis, the urge to shout acts as a competitive feedback loop, prioritizing ego over survival data. My voice, conversely, carried zero ego and zero aggression. It was purely optimized for information transfer and cognitive clarity. I gave not an order but an operational truth." He paused, allowing the gravity of the cultural analysis to settle. To a Kthar, noise is proof of struggle. But in the vacuum of a true crisis, the absence of struggle, the perfect calm, is recognized by their deepest, oldest instincts as the signal of the ultimate dominant intelligence. I didn't beat their noise, I bypassed their consciousness and commanded their survival mechanism. My calmness was the signal of my superior analysis. The human advantage, gentlemen, is not our lungs, but our capacity for silence under duress. The officers regarded the young human with a new, chilling respect. They were realizing that human timidity was actually a sophisticated form of controlled reserve. Darius approached Elias after the meeting, a moment fraught with unspoken tension. He did not issue a loud command or even offer a handshake. His response was far more profound. He lowered his huge head slightly and emitted a sound that the Cathar typically reserved for mating rituals or acknowledging a truly superior hunt master. A low, nearly subsonic rumble, a purr of instinctive deference. "Vance," Darius murmured, the word carrying a weight heavier than any shout he had ever unleashed. "You are not weak-voiced. You are dangerous. I will not forget what I heard today." Elias met the commander's eyes, finally allowing himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Nor will I, Commander." He simply nodded, reserving his strength, his voice and his full capability for the next inevitable crisis. He had entered the Vindicator as a figure of mockery. He left the debriefing not as a noisy superior, but as the quiet alpha, whose soft command had proven infinitely more potent than the combined volume of the Federation's greatest predators. The bridge, he knew, would never sound the same again.